Hello and welcome. I'm Adam with Pushing the Envelope, the channel that gives you everything artificial intelligence and machine learning. Well, if you made it to this point, congrats! You have made it past all of our Python Bootcamp tutorials. Now we're looking at how do we put that all together. So we have all these individual skills, reading files, if statements, for loops, functions. How do we come together, put it together to solve a real world problem? In this case, I've pulled a ton of stock data. We're going to be looking at how do we read in that stock data, how do we manipulate it, and then how do we actually go ahead and make it useful to us to solve actual problems. So, without further ado, let's jump over to Jupyter and we'll start working through this final capstone project. Alright, as you can see, our screen is up and we are good to go. Now, again, if you haven't been following along, I have this GitHub link here. It has all of the templates, all of the files, all of the solutions all stored together. Highly recommend that you actually use it for this tutorial, this capstone project, because there's going to be a lot of text on the screen telling you what to do, and there's also going to be a lot of data stored in the background files that you're not going to be able to easily copy over. So hop over there, go ahead, grab the files, come on back, and we will go ahead and get started. Now, we're going to have a lot of sections here because we're going to be putting it kind of all together, all of the different things that we've been doing up until this point. So as you can see, we're scrolling down. We have 8 different sections. I won't go through what they all are right now because we're actually going to dive into each one of them. So first section, we're going to be reading in stock data. So I want you to go ahead and follow these steps here. So create a function that is going to read in the stock data. The stock data is called stock_data.txt. Now I have that up in the background. Let me slide the screen over a little bit, and you can see we have a date column, an open column, and a close column. And in each of these columns, we have those dates. We have a price, which is the opening price, and we have a price, which is the closing price. And you can see our file is fairly large, lots of data inside of it. So go ahead, create a function that will read this in. And your output is going to be lists of your pricing data. So it's going to be the dates as one list, the opening prices as another, and the closing prices as a third. As you can see right here, where we're calling the function, those 3 are going to be saved and returned by this function. Our input is going to be wherever the file lives. In this case, I have it stored in a folder called files, and the name of the file is called stock data. Okay, so within the function, you're going to read each of the lines using read lines. You need to skip the first line because those are headers, so go ahead and skip that one. Then using a for loop, I want you to remove the special characters. Remember, when you read the line, you're going to have hidden special characters for the end of the line, so you need to remove those. You need to split the values so that you can have those each individually. Convert any number values to floating points, and then save each of those into those respective lists and return the list back to main. At the end of it, you should be able to print these lines, and these will be the outputs, just to kind of give yourself a check of what those should be looking like. Take some time. This one may take a little longer. See what you can do. See if you're able to figure this out. We'll come back and we'll work this step together before moving on to the next one. All right. Hopefully you were able to at least take a stab at it. If you were able to get all of it, that's great. If you're able to match the outputs, that's even better. So let's go ahead and work through how we can actually do this. So defining a function called, let's just call it read stock data. And again, our inputs are going to be right here where we're calling the function. Actually, I'm just going to call the function down here because that will help me remember what we're passing in and out. So passing in is going to be our file name. I'm just going to call it file for now. And our outputs, I'm just going to put them in right now. So I'm going to return dates, opens, and closes. I'm going to keep them the same within the function. They don't have to necessarily be the same names. All right, so since we're opening a file, we are going to use with open. We're passing in the file name, so with open file as f. So this is going to open our file as f. Now we're going to say for line in lines, in f.readlines. Now, this is important here. So like I said, if we go back to our file, the very first line is our date, open, and close. So the headers of the file. Now, not necessarily important that we read those, and we actually don't want to read those because we only want the dates, the opens, and the closes. So in order to skip those lines, if you remember when we indexed the list, what you could do was using indexing, so brackets. I want to say I want the first index, which is the second line on. Okay, so this will completely skip the first line. All right, now what you're going to do is if we ran this, you would see that each line has a special character, and those special characters are the end line. So we need to remove those special characters. So line equals line dot replace, and we are going to be replacing the \n character, the new line character. We're going to be replacing it with nothing. That completely will remove it from the list. All right. Now that we have that, we can go ahead and grab each of those values. If we go back to our file, you can see each one of these are separated by a comma. So we are going to be splitting our line on the comma. Those are going to be passed back as the date, the open, and the close. Open and close are keywords, so I'm not going to use those. I am actually just going to call this open price and close price because I don't want to override. If you can see, when we open the file, we used open here, so you don't want to save that as a new variable and override what the actual function is. So I'm going to call open and close price, and we are going to say line dot split, again, splitting on the comma. Now the date can stay as a string, but we need to convert the opening and closing prices to be integer value, or to be floating point values, excuse me. Because right now they're being saved as strings. So open price is going to be equal to float of open price. This is going to convert the string to a floating point. Same thing for closing price. So close price equals float of close price. Okay. So now, this will give us the date, the opening, and closing price for each line, but we need to save those into some list that we return. And those lists are going to be called dates, opens, and closes. So before we even open the file, let's go ahead and make those empty lists. So dates, opens, closes. And we are going to be appending, remember appending is when you add a new value to a list. And since the list is blank, we're just going to be adding those values and creating the list as we go. So we're going to say dates.append date, opens.append open price, and closes.append close price. Once those are made and once our file is closed, at the very end, we will return those back to main. Now again, if we look up here, I gave you 3 statements that you can print out. I will go ahead and copy those down here, and we will see if we get those same answers or not. So printing that one, and finally printing the final one for closes. All right. As you can see, here's our outputs. They do match what we were expecting for the outputs up here. You could round these values if you wanted to. I'm going to leave them as a whole bunch of different values because we're going to be using multiplying those in the future, and I don't want to lose precision here. So I will keep these not as just rounded off to 2 decimal places. Okay, well that takes care of the first section. So again, we're moving through this example and on to the next part, which is sort of along the same lines, but we have another file that has all of the number of shares that we own of each stock, of this stock. To look at that file, you can see here, we have whatever our date is, and we have however many shares that we own at that date. So we have the date of 8/12/2019, and at that date we owned 18 shares of this stock. Same thing for the next day, we own 6, 8, 9, whatever, moving on. Okay, so I want you to, again, as the input, take in wherever the file is located. In this case, it's called myshares.txt, and it's inside of the files folder. And I want you to output a list of the shares. So remember, the columns are dates and the shares. So go ahead and return. In this case, you can only return the shares. That's fine. You don't need to return the dates. So within the function, I want you to sort of do the same thing. Use read lines, loop through it, remove special characters, split the values. If we look at shares, again, separated by a comma, so it's almost identical to what we did in the last section. But I only want you to save the share values in a list and return the list. So go ahead and make that new function. You can almost just copy what we did in the last section, move it down here, and change some of the values of where it's pointing to and what it's being saved as. But go ahead, do that, come on back, and we will work it. Okay, so I am going to actually just go to the top, and I'm going to copy the whole function. So copy everything we did for the function, move it down here, and we're just going to adjust so we don't have to write it all out again. In this case, this one is going to be called read share data. And again, it's going to be taking the file location. So we can keep that as file. Now, we're not going to have dates open and closes. We're only going to have shares. So make sure to adjust your return value accordingly to only return shares. Moving down here, we will be reading the file. We will be reading each of the lines, looking at the file. There is a header, so we will skip the first line again. Skipping the first line, replacing special characters. Now, when we split this, we only have two. We have the date and we have the share price. So on the split, we only are returning two variables here, date and share. I'm going to remove everything else that I did. The only thing we need to do is convert the share into an integer. Remember, when we read it, it will be a string. So share is equal to the integer of share. And then we need to say shares.append, add that share value into our list to be able to return to main. Step 3 is where we call it, so I'm going to copy that line. And step 4 is when we test it, so I'm also going to copy that line to make sure we have read it in right. As you can see, 1868, same thing as what we're printing out here, so we were successful in reading that in the correct way. All right. Hopefully we're able to get that. If not, fix your code. Try to get to where we're at this point, because if you haven't got the first two where we need it to be, all of the rest are going to be incorrect because we're going to be using these values in all the other functions. Okay. Step 3, calculate the change in price. Okay, so I want you to make a function called calcPriceChanges. And this is going to calculate the difference between the opening and the closing price. So your input is going to be the two lists, the opening values, which was from the first step, and the closing values, which was from the first step. You're going to take both of those in, and your output is going to be all of the price changes as a list. So price changes are going to be calculated by subtracting the closing values from the opening values, and then saving the result in a new list, and then returning that list to the main. So go ahead, see what you can get there. Again, here, if you need a reference, here is how we're going to be calling the function. So try to match your inputs and outputs to be similar to what we have here in this function call. All right. Assuming you were able to get this, let's see. If not, go ahead and copy what I'm doing here in order to fix your code. So I'm just going to end with whatever our function call is. And using this, we can see our function name is called calcPriceChanges. So define a new function with that name. And it's going to be taking in the opening prices and the closing prices. And it's going to be returning changes. Okay. Changes is going to be a list, so I'm just going to define a new list right now because I know I'm going to need to be saving that as a list. Now we're going to be using a for loop to do this. as you can see right here in step 2. So use a for loop. So for, and here we're going to have two lists that we're moving over. So I cannot say for x in open. So I can't grab every opens price as x because I'm going to have two lists. So I'm going to need to index it. Use the index to grab the values. So for x in range length of opens. If you remember our for loop, this range length of our list means create a range from 0 to the end of the list. In this case, the end of the list would be the length of opens. Okay, when we are referencing this, we're going to say change is equal to closes. Remember, if we want to do this by indexing, we need to index each list at x. X is going to store whatever index we're at within the for loop. So closes minus opens. Remember to include those indexes, or else you're going to be subtracting an entire list, instead of the values at each position. Last thing we need to do is changes.append, add that value to a new list to be returned back to main. Here is our test, so printing the first 3 of changes. Running that, you can see our values match up with our output right here that we are expecting. So again, hopefully we're able to get that. If not, go back, solve your first 2 problems, the first 2 steps, and get to this point. Now, I used opens and closes because if we go back up to the first section, that is what I saved opens and closes as. If you ended up changing the name and you didn't store it as opens and closes, that's okay, but you're going to get an error when you try to run this. So you need to change these to whatever you saved the values in step 1 as. Okay. Again, working our way through this, now we're going to calculate the account price changes. So what does that mean? Well, I want you to, let me get this all on screen here. I want you to create a function called calcAccountChanges. Again, use step 3 as a reference to what your inputs, outputs, and function names should look like. But this function will calculate the price based on those changes we had in the last section and the shares that we pulled in section 2. So we're going to be multiplying, so using a for loop here, step 2, multiply the number of shares by the change in price. Save the results of the new list, return the list to main. That new list is going to be called diffs when we return it. Again, you can change it, but you need to make sure your names match up for the next sections to follow. Okay, so again, go ahead, see what you can do there. I suggest copying step 3, putting it down there to match all of your inputs, outputs, and function names, and then work from there to create the actual list. Come on back and we will work it. All right, taking my advice, I am going to copy this down here. So we have a new function called this function name right here, calcAccountChanges. This is going to take in 2 values. It's going to take in changes and it's going to take in shares. This is also going to return a list of diffs. So define a new list. Okay, that's our template for our function. Now, what are we doing? So looking at step 2, we're using a for loop, so for. And again, we're looping over 2 lists, so we need to use indexing. We're looping over changes and shares. So for x in range, length of changes. You could use shares here if you wanted to. It's really just, since they're the same length, doesn't matter. You can use either length to run through this loop. So we need to make a new value called diff, and that's going to be equal to the changes at x times the shares at x. Remember, when you're doing this, you need to remember to include that index, or else you're going to be trying to multiply the entire list by some value, and it's not going to work out for you. This is going to calculate our difference, and so we are going to append that value. So, sorry, diffs.append that value to our list here. Once we have those values added to the list, and we've gone through the entire length of the file, we are going to return diffs to main, and then we are going to test it using step 4. Running that, we have the same values as you can see right here. Okay. Moving down the line, again, if you weren't able to get that, go ahead, try to fix it. You need to get these lined up in order for the next steps to work. All right, next step, writing the account prices to a new file, the changes in prices to a new file. So you're going to create a new function called write account changes. Your input is going to be the difference list, so the list that we just created in the last section, and a file name to store the values you're about to write. In this case, go ahead and call the file myaccount.txt, and I'm going to be storing it in the files folder. So this is where I'm going to write my new file. Your output, you're not going to have an output because you're only writing, you're not going to be returning anything to main, so you don't have to worry about an output. Now, within the function, you're going to use a loop, so you can use a for loop, and you're going to write each value within the difference list to the file. Okay? And so this is what the function call is going to look like. You're going to take your file name in, you're going to take your difference list, doesn't matter which order you put it in, just make sure that you pass it the right way when you go to call the function and when you create the function. But this is what your output is going to look like for the first 3 lines of the file. So you can go check the file after and see that it matches up. Okay, so again, take some time, see what you can do, and we will work it after you're done. All right, let's go ahead and start working this together. So again, I'm going to copy step 3, use that as my template moving down here. So I'm going to create a new function called write account changes, copying this function name. Now we are going to be taking the file that we're going to be writing to, and we're going to be taking the difference lists and using that within the function. Okay. Now we are going to be writing to a file, so we need to open that file in order to write to it. So with open file. Now, since we are writing a file, remember to pass in that W character. So we need to tell the file this is a writable file. I'm going to pass it as W. I could do it as F in this case since I don't have a file saved as F, but W will make it easier. Now, we're going to loop through each of the diffs. So using a for loop, write each value of diffs to the new file. So for diff in diffs, we don't need to use indexing this because we only have one list. You can use indexing if you want, but I'm just going to use value by value throughout the list. And I'm saving those values as diff. So we are going to say w.write. This is how you write to a file. Diffs is stored as a floating point right now, which will not work for writing to a file. Writing to a file really needs a string. So we're going to say string of diff plus, remember to always add that end character so that you are writing to a new line every single time. If not, you're going to have one massive line of all of these different diff values. So this /n is the new character for the file. If you go ahead and run this, you're going to create a new file called myaccount.txt. So running this, let it write all of those files. Opening the file, here's what it looks like. And the first 3 are -14, 7, and 18. So let's go back and compare that to what we have here, negative 14, 7, and 18. Yes, so we have written the first 3 lines correctly. Again, if you haven't, try to match it up. But this is really, again, how you write to a file, and we will move on with that in the next section. Okay, calculating the account total. Scrolling to fit everything in the screen here. All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to create a function called calc account total. And this function is going to sum up the entire account based on your stock changes. So your input is going to be some starting amount. So let's say I have 10 grand in my account. That's what I'm going to be passing to this function. So some floating number. And then I'm going to have all of those diffs that I calculated. That's that list that we just wrote to the file. We're just going to use the list. Our output is going to be our account total. And our account total is going to change based on those differences. So we're going to initialize right here in step 2. We're going to initialize the running sum to be whatever our starting amount was. So if we have 10 grand in our account to start with, we are initializing some value that's storing our running sum as that starting amount. If we have $0, it's going to start with $0. Using a while loop. Now remember, this is a while loop instead of a for loop. I want you to add the value of diff to the running sum. Okay? So that's what you're going to do. You're going to add that to the running sum for every single difference in the diffs list. Once you're done and you've calculated the final sum, return that sum back to main. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, use this as what you're trying to do in order to call the function. And then check the output. So if you pass in all of the differences and you pass in $10,000, here's what the output should look like. Go ahead, try that out. If you get stuck, come on back and we will work it together. Okay. Again, I'm going to take that line and use that as my default to create the function. We're going to call this function calc account total, and we are going to pass it in some starting amount and some differences. We are going to be returning whatever our account balance was, so I'm going to return that as account. Alrighty. We're going to be using a while loop, and we're going to be looping from the front of the list. So we're going to start where the index equals 0. Because remember, in a while loop, you need to physically set your indexing. And unlike the for loop, which will take care of that part for you, you're going to need to, again, set those values manually. Our while loop starts with while, and then it looks for some condition. So while our index is less than the length of the list. So while we haven't hit the end of the list, keep pulling values. We're going to be updating our account to add in that differences value. So you can do account plus equals diffs. Now you might be wondering what account is because we haven't defined it. So we need to, at the very top, define what account is. An account, again, is going to be equal to whatever that starting value is. So I could have passed account as the name for this, but I'm just going to say account is equal to the starting value just in case we wanted to change what the value of account was within the function. Okay, so we are changing account by adding our diffs amount to it. Now, if I pass it in like this, we are going to be attempting to add the entire list to the account, which is not what we want to do. Again, when you're using a while loop or a for loop with indexing, you need to make sure you index the list. So the diffs at I, since we're using I in this case. Last thing to remember is that when you're using a while loop, you need to update the index or else you're going to be stuck in a forever loop, because it will never not be less than the length of diffs. So we need to add 1, so plus equals 1, to our counter. All right, we are then returning our final account back to main, and it's going to be stored as account. So if I print account, hopefully it will be equal to our step 4 output. Running this, and yes, it is equal to our step 4 output. Hopefully you were able to get that. Again, fix it if you were not able to. Go back, see what problems you messed up on, because we're going to continue to move through this Capstone project. All right. So moving on, we are going to be saving user information now. So we are going to make a function called getUserInfo. It's not going to take any inputs, but our outputs are going to be first, last name, and birthday. So since we're not taking any inputs and passing it into the function, we need to get those inputs from the function itself. So we're going to be using the command line to ask the user for their first name, their last name, and their birthday. And we want to make sure that the birthday is formatted as this right here. So the full year, hyphen the month, hyphen the day. And again, after you have all of those values, you're just going to return the first name, the last name, and the birthday back to main. So it's going to look like this when we go to call the function. You can copy that and you can move it down to the section to get started. Now, step 4 for checking output. There really is no output because it's just going to echo whatever the user put in. So you can just print the first, last, and birthday and make sure it's equal to whatever you input into the computer, into the command line. Try that, come on back, and we will go through it together. All right. Again, I'm going to paste step 3 down here, just so we have a sense of what we're looking for. We are going to be defining a new function called getUserInformation. It is not going to have any inputs, so we don't need to worry about passing anything in the parentheses, but it is going to be returning, let me scroll down a little bit, it is going to be returning first, last, and birthday. So we're going to be returning 3 things here. All right, so we have first, last, and birthday. Now we need to set these equal to something before we return them to the screen. So what is first? Well, first, again, is going to be asking the user for something. So to ask the user for something, we're going to use the function called input, and that is the built-in Python function. It's going to be looking for a prompt within the parentheses. In this case, what is your first name? Okay, that is going to save whatever the user puts in as the first name. If we copy this down here to the last name, and we just need to change what is your last name. And finally, copying it one more time, we can say what is your birthday. Now, something you may want to add is just like within the prompt, have some parentheses and show them what format they should be inputting their birthday as. So I can say, what is your birthday, and give them a hint that this is the format they should be returning it as. And that really should be it. So I'm going to print first, last, birthday to the screen so that we can compare what our outputs are to our inputs. So if I say I am Tom White and my birthday is 1967 hyphen 09 hyphen 15. All right, so September 15th, 1969 is my birthday. Now when I print that back out, you can see first name, last name, and birthday are all printed exactly like we entered it in here, and it's returned from the function back to main to use for the last step that we're about to do. Again, something's wrong, go ahead and fix it, but we're going to be moving on and closing out this Capstone project. And this one is a fairly long a step, but it's mostly just because there's a lot that we need to describe in what we're doing here. So we're going to be creating an account, and all it's going to be doing is saving it as a class. So this class is going to have some variables, and the variables are going to be balance is equal to $10,000. Okay, so that is a variable not defined within the init function. So you can go ahead and just hard code that value as at the very beginning. Step 3, we're going to be defining that init function. And it's going to take in 3 things from main. So when we initialize it, it's going to take in the first name, the last name, and the birthday. Everything that we collected in the last step. We are going to be assigning those first names, last names, and birthdays to variables within the class. And then we are going to assign an account number using the function genAccount. Now, genAccount is something that we're going to define within the class as another function, as you can see in the next step. So not only do we have the variables, the init function, but we also have some other functions that we need to define. GenAccount, not going to take any inputs, but we're going to generate a 10-digit random number. Remember, random.randint is the function that we can use to generate a random number. And you're just going to use a for loop and generate 10 random numbers and save them to a string. And then save that string to a new variable within the class. Or sorry, return that variable back to an int so it can save it as a new variable within the class. We're going to have 2 other functions. We're going to have one to update the balance. So when we update the balance, we're going to be requesting that the new balance is an input into the function call, which is going to be a floating point. It's not going to be returning anything, but it's going to update the balance variable. Again, step 2, balance variable, updating that value within the class to be the new balance that is passed in. Last thing, printing all of the account information, not taking any inputs, not taking any outputs, but all it's doing is printing out the person's first name, last name, account number, and balance. All that being said, you can use these last 3 lines as a way to actually use the class and see what you're able to get. Again, make sure that you're able to print all of the values out. First, last, birthday are going to be in the last section, and our account balance is going to be calculated in the section prior to that. So right here in step 6, sorry. Okay, so take a stab at that. Again, this is a lot of text here, but it's all about defining a class to store this person's account information in. Once you're able to get to a point, or maybe if you get stuck, come on back, work it line by line with us. All right. Now, if you remember, defining a class is fairly easy. It's just class is equal to account. We're going to call our class account. Make sure you add your parentheses and a colon, and then everything in the class is going to go under it. Now, if we scroll back up here, our variables are going to be balance. So we're going to have balance equal to 10,000. That's our only variable that we're going to store. Next thing, if we scroll back up here, we're going to define our initialization function. So our initialization function is going to have 3 inputs, first name, last name, and birthday. So defining init is underscore underscore init, followed by underscores again. It's going to take in self. Remember, when we're defining a function within the class and we want to use the class variables, you need to pass in self. It's going to be taking in first name, last name, and birthday. And we're going to be setting those values of the class. So self dot, let's just call it first, is equal to first name. Self dot last is equal to last name. And self dot birthday is equal to birthday. All right, let's go back up to our init function. So that takes care of assigning the first, last, and birthday variables. Now we have one more where we're going to have an account number that's equal to genAccount. So self.account num is equal to genAccount. I believe that's what I called it. Yep, genAccount. All right. Since genAccount is a function within the class, we cannot just call it like this. We actually have to say self.genAccount because it's going to be looking for a function within the class. All right, that takes care of that, but now we need to actually define what genAccount is. So init's done, moving on to defining our functions. So def gen account. Let's look at gen account in step 4. So our inputs, we're not going to have any inputs. All we're doing is outputting a 10-digit random number. So no inputs. We're going to have a number that's equal to an empty string right now, and we're just going to do a for loop. So for x in range 10, again, because it's going to be 10 digits long, we are going to be generating a random number for each one of these digits. In order to use random.randint, we do need to import the random package. If you remember using this in some of the previous examples of generating the dice roll or some of the other things that we used it for. But we have this number, and each time we go through, we want to add that number to number. So number plus equals random.randint, and it's going to be a random number from 0 to 9. Now, since number is a string and randint is going to be some integer, we need to convert our integer to a string in order to do string math and append it to our account number. Once all of that is complete, we can return number back to main. Okay, so that takes care of gen account. Next, we have something called update balance. That's going to take in a new balance variable. It's not going to output anything. All it's going to do is update the balance variable. So if we come down here, define one more function called update balance, we're going to pass it in self because we're going to be updating some of the class variables. So pass in self and pass in a value that we pass into the function, which is new balance. All right. If we go back up here, all we're doing is updating the balance variable with the new balance. So we're going to say self.balance equals new balance. And that's it. That's all we're doing within this function. All right, last function that we need, if we scroll back up, is a function to print the account information. Not taking any inputs, not taking any outputs. All we're doing is printing the first, last account number and balance. So define a new function called print account info. We do need to pass in self because we are referencing the class variables in order to print this statement out. We are printing name. And name is going to be equal to self.first, self.last. It's going to print the first and last name of the person. We are also going to be printing the account number. Account number is going to be equal to self.accountNum. If you remember back up here in the init function, we saved that as account num. Lastly, we are going to be printing our balance. Our balance is equal to self.balance. And that's it. That's our entire class. Let's use these last 3 lines here. So defining a new user. We need to make sure our indent is all the way over. Okay, so we're defining a new user. We're updating the user's balance to be this account.balance. And we are using the print function that we just made to print all of the information to the screen. If we run this, we'll see if we have any errors. We do. Let's see. Gen account takes 0 position. Okay, so back up at gen account, we do need to pass in self here because we're using the function within the class. So pass in self, and that will take care of that. All right, we have the person's name, which is Tom White, which if you remember in the previous section, if I scroll back up, we saved Tom White as the name. Birthday is September 15th, 1967. A random account number was assigned to Tom, and our balance is $5,000 $627 with some change. If you look back up here, that does match what our account balance should be. And so with that, that is actually going to close out our Capstone project. I hope this was a good way of bringing everything together, bringing in functions, for loops, if statements, combining all of that with reading and writing to files to give you kind of a holistic idea of what you can do with Python. Now I'm going to have a couple more videos. The next one is going to be introducing some packages that really allow you to do everything we did here very quickly and be able to actually visualize some of the data that we pulled in. So we're going to be looking at the pandas package and the matplotlib pyplot package. So those are two very common ones that you use for data analytics, data science type things. But again, they allow you to pull in lots of data, read it very fast, update it very fast, and allow you to actually start creating some charts and things that will be useful. So that's going to be a quick introduction, and then I may have a bonus video of how do you read through some of the errors that you may get. So you've noticed I've had a couple errors as I've typed this. One thing you're going to find as you're doing this is, especially starting out, you're going to get a lot of errors. And one of the key things that you need to learn is how to read those errors in order to fix your code. Because even though I've only made a few errors in this, it's because I've prepared. I have the solutions off to the side, and so I kind of know already what I'm doing, but I run into errors all the time, and a lot of people coding will hit errors all the time. And that's something you don't necessarily see as a beginner. And a good lesson will be how do you actually read through those errors and fix them for yourselves, because you run into them a lot. So I'll stop talking there. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for joining me on this one, and until next time.